Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to explore the native HTML dialog element, which makes it easy to create pop-ups, alerts, and modals on a web page. We're going to learn functions, attributes, and events that the element provides, how to add animations when opening a dialog, how it works with a form, and many other functionalities with just few CSS and JavaScript. But before we jump into the new dialog element, let's see one of the traditional ways to implement a modal dialog on a web page without the dialog element. Before we check the code, let's see how it works on the browser. So if I click on the Open Dialog button, you can see that we have a very simple modal dialog with an overlay covering the page. And here we have the dialog box with a message and a close button that when we click, it closes the dialog and the overlay as well. And if we open again, the dialog is in front of the entire page, making it impossible to access other elements on the page. As you can see, I'm trying to click on the Open Dialog button here. So let's check the code here. For the HTML, we have the button element, which is the Open Dialog button here. And we have a div, which is the overlay here covering the page. And the dialog box is inside the overlay div here. And inside the dialog box, we have a paragraph, which is the message, and the close button. Very simple. And we have a little bit of CSS here. So for the overlay, we set the background color as black with a transparency, the width and height of 100% covering the entire window, and display as none to initially hide the dialog. And then we have the dialog class referring to the dialog box with a white background, a black solid thin border, and some padding for the elements inside to be separate from the edges. And note here that we have the open class added to the overlay, which is a class we'll add to the overlay div using JavaScript to show the overlay and the dialog inside, changing the display property from none to flex, and centering the dialog box on the page. Okay, now let's check the JavaScript code down here. So we start by selecting the open and close buttons and the overlay div. We have a click event for the open dialog button, which adds the open class to the overlay and show the dialog. And we also have a click event for the close button inside the dialog, which we just remove the open class from the overlay div, hiding the overlay and the dialog box. And up here we have a key down event for the entire HTML body, checking if we press the escape key, and then it also removes the open class from the overlay, consequently closing the dialog. So here on the browser, if we press the escape key, the dialog is also closed. So this is one of the standard ways to implement a dialog, but there are some issues with this solution. First, we have to manipulate CSS classes to hide or show the dialog, and it might get confused if we implement more functionalities. And probably the biggest issue here is if we keep pressing the tab key on the browser, you can see that we can select the open dialog button behind the overlay. So for example, I'll add a message on the console here inside the open dialog button click event saying open button click it. Now, if we open the console here on the browser and open the dialog, we can see the message on the console. Now, if we keep pressing the tab key, it will focus on the open dialog button here. And if I press enter, we can see that we were able to hit the button many times as we want, and we can actually interact with the entire page by pressing tab. So this is obvious, not the ideal solution. Now, let's use the dialog element instead of this solution here. So here inside the body, we'll add the dialog element, and inside I'll just cut the content from down here and paste inside the dialog. And we can remove this code here, and actually we can remove all these styles for now. Okay, and here on the JavaScript code, we can remove the code from the open dialog button click event and for the close dialog as well, and here inside the key down event. Okay, now on the browser, if we inspect the elements here, you can see that the dialog is here, but it's not showing on the page. That's because the display property is set to none by default. But we can change that by adding an attribute here on the dialog called open. And now we have an open dialog here on the page, and on the styles, we have a dialog with the open attribute class with the display property set to block. And we could trigger this open attribute, I guess, but it's not advised to use the open attribute directly. Instead, the recommended solution is open through JavaScript code. So let's remove this open attribute here. And on the JavaScript, we can get rid of this overlay selector here. And instead, let's create a new selector for the dialog element using a class called Dialog. So I'll add the class called Dialog here on the dialog element. We could use an ID here as well, but you can use whatever you prefer. And here on the open dialog button, click event, we can call the dialog element, and we have a show function here. Now, if we click on the open dialog button, here's the dialog open, and if we inspect here, you can see that the open attribute was added as well. But there's no overlay on the background. The dialog is not centered, and we have access to the elements on the page while the dialog is open. To change this, instead of the show function, we can use the show model function. Now, if we click on the open dialog button, perfect. We have an overlay here, the dialog is on the center, and we no longer have access to the elements on the page. Even if we press the tab key, the elements behind the dialog won't receive the focus. That's perfect. Now we need to close the dialog when clicking on the close button. So here on the close button, click event. We can call the dialog element and just call the close function. Simple as that. Now let's open the dialog and click on the close button. Perfect, the dialog gets closed. And we don't even need to check for the escape key here on the K down event anymore. Because if we open the dialog again, and now I'll press the escape key, and perfect, the dialog gets closed. That's because the dialog element already have a built-in functionality to close when the escape button is being pressed. But this functionality only works if we use the show model function to open the dialog, and not the show function. So if we open the dialog now and press the escape button, the dialog won't close. Only if we click on the close button calling the close function. Now let me change back here to show model. And what if we want to change the style on this overlay here to another opacity or another color, for example? To do so, we can add some style to the dialog class. So dialog, and we can use the backdrop pseudo element to change the style of the overlay. So here, for example, let's change the background color using RGBA function. So let's add a black color with opacity a little darker than this. So I'll put 0.6 here. Now if we open the dialog, the overlay color is a little darker and we can change to a different color. So let's say blue here, and we can change the opacity to 0.6. And if we open the dialog again, there it is. Instead of changing the background color, we can add a blur effect, calling the backdrop filter property with a blur function of 1 pixel. And once we open the dialog, we have all elements blurred. Let me add more elements to the page, for example, a paragraph, and I'll type Lauren 2000 to generate a huge text here. And perfect, all elements get blurred. We can even scroll the page while the dialog is open, but we don't have access to the elements. Great. Let me remove the paragraph here and change the backdrop here back to the background color, calling the RGBA function with a black color and transparency with 0.5. Okay, looks good. Now let's see some events that we can use for the dialog. So for example, I'll add an event listener for the close event. And I'll add a message on the console saying close. Now let's open the console on the browser. Open the dialog, and when we close the dialog, you can see that the close event was triggered because the close function was called. Now let's add another event listener for the dialog, and this will be the cancel event. And I'll add a message on the console saying cancel. And just recapping, the close event that we have here is only triggered when we call the close function of the dialog. Okay? Now, the cancel event gets fired when we close the dialog using the escape key. And after, the close event gets fired as well. So now when we press the escape key, you can see the cancel, and right after the close event was triggered. So let's say, for example, we don't want to close the dialog when pressing the escape key. Here on the cancel event listener, we can add an event parameter here on the function and call event prevent default function. And I'll leave the cancel message on the console. Open the dialog, and when we press escape, the event is being triggered, but the dialog remains open. Great. Let's close here, and perfect. Now, unfortunately, the dialog element doesn't have an open event when we call the show or the show model function. But we do have a workaround, which is to create a JavaScript Mutation Observer that provides the ability to watch for changes being made to the DOM. Let me paste some lines of code here. So here we're creating a new mutation observer, which will invoke a specified callback function when the DOM changes occur. And inside this callback function, we're showing on the console the open property of the dialog element, which is a Boolean value reflecting the open HTML attribute, indicating whether the dialog element is showing on the page. And here we want to observe only for changes on the dialog element. And for the options here, we want to watch for changes on attributes. And we're adding a filter to only watch for changes to the open attribute, if it is added to the element or not. So here in the browser, let me open the console, and once you open the dialog, the open property value is being printed on the console, indicating that the dialog is open. Because here on the element, the open attribute is added, and we added a filter to watch only for this attribute. And if we close the dialog, it shows false on the console, indicating the dialog is not visible anymore. We could add an if statement here to only do something when the dialog open property is true. And it also shows close here because we added an event for the close function. Great! So this is how we can write an open event for the dialog using Mutation Observer. Okay, let me close the console here on the browser. Now let me open the dialog here. And if we click outside the dialog on the backdrop, the dialog will not close. I'm clicking all over here and nothing happens. Unfortunately, the dialog element doesn't provide a feature to close when clicking outside. Let's see two ways to handle this situation. The simplest one is to add a div inside the dialog. I'll add a class of dialog, content, and I'll cut and paste all the content inside this div. Now here on the styles, I'll call the dialog class to remove all padding inside the dialog. Next, I'll call the dialog content class, and I'll add the padding here inside. Let me check the default padding of the dialog element here, and it's 1 EM. Okay, so here inside the class, we'll add a padding of 1 EM. Okay, if we check the dialog now, it still looks the same. Let me add another event listener for the dialog here. Let me just remove the close and cancel event. So dialog, add event listener, and this time it's the click event. Whenever we click on the dialog or the backdrop, this event will be triggered. So I'll write a message on the console calling the event.target so we can see where exactly we're clicking. And let me just remove this mutation observer here. Okay, now on the browser, let me open the console and open the dialog. Now, if we click on the backdrop here, you can see that we're clicking on the dialog element. And if we click inside the dialog box, you can see that now we're clicking on the dialog content div. So inside the click event, we can add an if statement, checking if the event target is equals to the dialog element we selected here. If it is, that means we're clicking on the backdrop here, and then we can call the dialog close function. Let me remove the console log here and open the dialog again. Now, if we click on the backdrop, which is the dialog element, the dialog will close. Anywhere we click on the backdrop, the dialog will close. But if we click inside the dialog box, the dialog remains open, and we can only close if we click on the close button. Awesome. So this is the simple way to handle this, and it works great. But we do have a more complex way to do this as well if you don't want to add a div inside the dialog. So let me remove the div here and paste the content directly inside the dialog. And let me also remove the styles here. Now on the dialog click event, I'll paste some lines of code here. So it looks a little complex, but here we're basically getting the size of the dialog box and checking if where we're clicking is outside of the dimensions of the dialog box. If it is, we just call the dialog close function. Let's open the dialog here, and if we click anywhere on the backdrop, the dialog will close. Let's try again. Great. Now, if we click inside the dialog box, nothing happens and the dialog remains open. And we can close by clicking on the close button. I wish this was something built into the dialog element, but luckily it is easy enough to add this functionality ourselves. Perfect. Let me just remove the click event listener here. Now, one very cool feature of the dialog element is if we have a form inside the dialog. So let me remove the content of the dialog and paste a simple form template here. So we have a name field, email field, and the submit button. And if we click on the submit, the dialog is closed automatically and the form was submitted, as you can see here on the URL. But what if we don't want to submit the form but still close the dialog when we click on the submit button? On the form element, we can add the method attribute and select the dialog option. Now let's test this. I'll just remove the URL here. Now open the dialog, and if we click on submit, the dialog was closed, but the form wasn't submitted. Awesome. Let's open again, and if we type some information here on the fields and click on the submit to close, when we open the dialog again, the fields remain filled with the information we entered. Great! Now what if we do want to submit the form, but we also want to have a close button next to the submit button? So here we'll add another button with the cancel value, and let's remove the submit type here, and let's remove the method here because we might want to call the get or post method instead. So I'll change it to get, and I'll add an action here pointing to another route, for example /add user. Now if we click on the submit or the cancel button, the form gets submitted either way. But we don't want to do that on the cancel button. So we can add on the cancel button the form method attribute with the dialog option. Now let's open the dialog. If we click on the submit button, the dialog closes and the form gets submitted. And we got this message here because the add user route doesn't exist. So let me go back and open the dialog again. Now when we click on the cancel button, the dialog closes and the form doesn't get submitted. This is very useful when we need to create model forms. The dialog element handles everything automatically with no JavaScript code. Awesome. Let me put the content we had back here on the dialog. Now, what if we want to open the dialog with some animation? Let's say a slide or a fade animation. We can easily achieve that by creating animation using keyframes, for example. And I'll name dialog animation. And when a dialog starts, so 0%, and here we're gonna add a slide from bottom, vertically animation. So I'll put transform and the translate Y, which is vertically, and I'll put 100% for example. So it's just gonna be a small margin here. Now here on the dialog, we have to put this animation when the dialog is open. So we need to use this class dialog with the open attribute. So on the styles, I'll add the dialog class containing the open attribute. And inside we'll call the animation property. So the first parameter is the animation name. So I'll grab the dialog animation and paste up here. And next is the time. So I'll put dot 2 seconds. And this is a normal animation. Now when we open the dialog, perfect, there's the animation, and we can change the time here to something a little slower like 0.7 seconds. Now when we open the dialog, you can see the animation sliding from 100% to 0, which is the default position. We can also add animation for the dialog backdrop here as well. And to grab the backdrop when the dialog is open, on the styles we can add the dialog class containing the open attribute. and call the backdrop pseudo element like this. Now let's create another keyframe here, and we'll name this dialog backdrop animation, and inside on the start of the animation 0%. So here we set the backdrop background color to black with transparency 0.5. Let me copy this and we'll paste here on the animation and change the transparency to 0. Now inside the class we'll add the animation property, the dialog backdrop animation, also with 0.7 seconds, and normal animation. So when we open the dialog, you can see that the backdrop is also animating. Let's open again. There it is, the dialog and the backdrop is animating. So it's really easy to add animations on the dialog element. And that's it. We saw in this video how easy it is to work with the native HTML dialog element and how powerful this element is. I'll leave the examples link we created on this video on the description below. If this video was helpful to you, please click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching and hope to see you on the next video.